name's Max Gagliardi, and you're listening to the Talk Energy Podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. You could leave a review. That would help the channel. This episode's sponsored by Fuze and the Digital Wildcatters. It's coming up this week. In fact, this episode is probably going to drop the day before Fuze, so unless you live in Houston, it may be too hard for you to get your tickets. But if you still haven't got your ticket and you want to go to the conference, you can use the promo code MAX, that's MAX, that'll get you $100 off. The Digital Wildcatter guys are bringing together everybody in energy, from the traditional energy world to the new energy world, and they're all going to have a discussion. It should be a great event, great networking. Get your tickets to Fuze if you haven't got them yet. Use my promo code, you get $100 off. This episode's guest is Dr. Chris Keefer, the host of the Decouple podcast and the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Chris got into the energy podcasting space about 2 years ago and has over 180 episodes out on the Decouple podcast. If you haven't checked it out, go and subscribe to Chris's channel. I've listened to a number of his episodes. They're great. If you like this channel, you're going to love Chris's stuff. Go check it out. Decouple podcast, subscribe. This episode, we discuss his recent trip to advocate for nuclear energy with Canada's top politicians, including the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We discuss the brewing scandal around the recently announced hydrogen project between Canada and Germany, and why so many economically unviable projects are getting pushed forward instead of turning towards the reliable energy that we have access to today. Lastly, we get Chris's views on what he's learned over the years through the podcast and his general take on energy. It's a fantastic episode. You won't want to miss this one. Hope you enjoy the show. Chris, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on.
Max, thanks for having me, man.
Way to do a restart there. Technical difficulties, it happens. So this is all fake for people that are watching. We've had this just once a second ago and it didn't work. But I think one of the upsides, what I was saying when we tried to do this intro a second ago, was that the upsides to doing the podcast, one of the big ones is you get to meet a lot of people and you force yourself to meet these people. And I've seen you out there with the Decouple podcast and doing the energy stuff. And it's a pleasure to meet you. And I'm happy that you're on.
No, absolutely. It's a huge sort of social capital machine having a podcast. I started mine kind of as a response to lockdowns during COVID. And I did college radio, in my college days. And I love that I could, read a book and convince the author to talk to me for an hour or something like that. It's an amazing tool. But yeah, I think similar to you, we've been in this game for about the same amount of time, 2 years. And I've met hundreds of great experts. And I feel like I just have this Rolodex of consultants I can chat with if I have an issue or if I don't understand something. It's just been a magnificent tool. And for all my friends that were struggling, during COVID, I was always like, you just got to start a podcast, man.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what, I think that's like, you're the same thing. I started during COVID and trying to connect with people. And it's funny, like, I'm glad that you get it, because a lot of people are kind of like, now it's less than it was at the beginning, but at the beginning it was kind of like, what are you doing? Like, what is this? Like people kind of like asking me, like, in my life, like, what's the point? Like, are you trying to like make money or whatever? And I'm just like, I'm connecting with lots of people. I get to learn all the time. And it's a way to just utilize technology in the way that I wasn't doing. And so I think you get it. But some more of your background, because I've read a little bit and I've listened to your podcast, but I've never gotten like your backstory, and I'm sure some of my guests haven't either. So maybe give us that start.
Sure. It's a long and winding road, man. I've done a lot of different things. Just catch you up on sort of where I'm at now, and maybe I'll try and work my way backwards. I'm a emergency medicine physician, and I've got a bunch of different organizations, a couple nonprofits, Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is a non-industry, independent, grassroots organization advocating for nuclear energy here in Canada. And I have a nonprofit that's not too active right now called Doctors for Nuclear Energy. You might sense a theme there. And of course, host of the Decouple podcast. My crowning achievement is I have a beautiful 4-year-old son. It's the light of my eyes. Awesome. And, in terms of the background, it's stranger than fiction in some ways. I've done a lot of zany things that I'm really grateful for. I was late to the energy game for sure. As a physician and as a kind of activist or advocate, I've had a lot of other issues I've been working on, issues of mostly around health justice and things like that. I helped set up the first migrant worker clinic here in Canada for seasonal agricultural workers from Mexico and Jamaica. I've been a consulting physician at the Center for Victims of Torture. I was a health columnist in Canada's largest Indigenous newspaper. And going back from that, I was a weird kid in school, and I really loved being out in the bush. I didn't come from a hunting family or anything like that, but I loved being out in the land, and I loved sort of survival stuff. And so I was, just to entertain your listeners, I was a survival instructor.
Wow.
I ran a trap line in the Yukon Territory. I was a horse wrangler and hunting guide for some time up there. So I've had a lot of really diverse life experiences, and each of them I'm incredibly grateful for, and each of them in some strange way inform, my present activities.
That's great. Well, I already kind of had an intuition that you would be somebody that, you clearly have to have care and empathy for others if you're going to be in the medicine field. And then now I know just from listening to your podcast and your advocacy around nuclear energy and concerns around climate, and then, you just have to be somebody that cares about others. I mean, specifically for the medicine thing, I mean, that's what struck me initially was like, this is somebody that has empathy. And so that's an interesting angle coming at the energy question, but then also the stuff about you being a survivalist and all that stuff too. I mean, I love the outdoors as well. I'm not as like manly about it, going out and surviving, but it's fun. I have an RV. So I take the Airstream out. It's mostly like an air conditioning sitting in it. But that's really interesting. But how, I guess then more specifically, the energy side, then what was like how did you get narrowed into wanting to focus on energy?
Yeah, for sure. So around the time of the birth of my son, like many folks of my age, I think also of my sort of political persuasion, I kind of come to this from, a so-called, I guess, progressive angle. There's a lot of climate concern, climate alarmism amongst my kind of tribe, people that I sort of emerged from, in terms of the university I was at and the kind of people I hung out with. And so you have this question around the time you have kids of, should I even be doing this, with what's going on with the climate? And I was like, what the hell is going on with the climate?
Right.
I have a pretty strong set of beliefs about it, but I haven't actually, investigated those or dug into the research. And so did a bunch of that, got pretty alarmed, became super boring at parties. And my ex at the time, she said, man, like, you got to do something about this. Like, don't just bitch about it. Excuse me. She said, get off your ass, do something about it. And what she meant was, sort the recycling better and take out the compost. And, having a scientific background with my medical education, and I dove into the literature and very rapidly came to the conclusion that the solutions were not that which were on offer from the environmental movement, which I was, I guess, somewhat adjacent to, those being essentially, it's that pseudo-religious Judeo-Christian worldview of, we've sinned against Mother Nature by industrializing. We have to atone for our sins, suffer a bunch, live like Stone Age people, and get back to the paradise of the Garden of Eden. And very quickly, through my reading, I recognized that to understand climate and climate response, if you don't understand energy, then you can have the best of intentions, but you're going to walk down that road to hell. And so it's led me on a very interesting journey, and that's kind of documented through the podcast, where I think I've really kind of matured my views. I'm still very concerned about climate, but very much recognize that the proximate impacts of, frankly, fucking up on energy are far graver and, again, far more proximate than the impacts of climate change. I do think the impacts of climate change are going to be an enormous challenge, especially on a century's timescale. But there's this kind of tragedy to the fact that, our civilization is a fossil fuel civilization. Václav Smil talks about this. The 4 pillars of civilization are concrete, steel, plastics, and fertilizer. Right. And then we have no scalable way to do that without fossil fuels. And so, it's given me a much more nuanced perspective. And of course, nuclear energy represents the most viable and scalable tool we have to replace fossil fuel services. But even with that, there's significant challenges. So yeah, I'm sort of drag on, but that's kind of that's the Cole's notes anyway of trying to sort of piece together how I got into energy.
It's interesting because I think it's a similar way that I've kind of evolved in thinking about it. I was, my background is actually in natural gas primarily and oil, but I've worked for the second largest producer of natural gas. And that was kind of, my dad's a geologist and was worked in the oil and gas industry my whole life. So grew up around it. But he's also, he's a scientist and an engineer. So I learned about the Earth's history and was always skeptical about some of the things and the claims around the climate stuff, because I knew just how crazy the times that we've come from have been, just from being a kid that had a dad that talked about Earth history a lot. And, but as I've gotten into the podcast, I've really tried to push myself to have alternative views and hear other people. And it can be a bit of an echo chamber sometimes. I mean, everybody has their biases and things that you lean towards. But what you find, I think, and it sounds like you echo this, is that it's incredibly nuanced. And without having those discussions, it is hard to formulate your opinions of it. What, in your opinion, telling me, coming from your side of it, what is the reason that many people on the progressive side, in your opinion, don't get to this more pragmatic conclusion around, for example, nuclear energy? A lot of environmentalists are anti-nuclear, or, for example, the need for energy today and the weighing and the pros and the cons. These are not common talking points from the people that are in the hardcore progressive or that side of it. What do you think causes that?
I mean, it's two things. One of them is we're sort of in this culture war echo chamber environment. Again, I come from a left background, and there's a real hesitancy to be exiled from the tribe. And I keep using words like, I'm just realizing this headset's not actually where the sound's coming through. But there's a fear of being exiled from the tribe. Why do I keep talking about tribe? I mean, from a kind of paleopsychology perspective, we've been on the planet for at least 200,000 years as a species, and most of that was in small sort of hunter-gatherer tribes. There was nothing worse than being exiled. The group is what provided protection to you, and that very much applies to the opinions that we hold. And there's a very real fear of exile. And on the left, I find there's a real sense that you must only sort of read books and articles from, publications or authors that have an impeccable record of following the orthodoxy. Like multiple times, if I would, reference an article written by, one of my favorite thinkers, like Mark P. Mills, right? I mean, he worked in the Reagan administration, I think, in missile guidance. He's someone that the left hates in a lot of ways, but he's brilliant on energy. And like, why does the left not get energy anymore? Well, it's because of something that happened, I think, kind of in the 50s and 60s, where, leftist thinkers started saying that, especially in the West, the working class was doing pretty well. That sort of post-war social contract between labor and business, where, working people really saw their living conditions improve dramatically. And those on the hard left that were, pushing for socialism and pushing for a kind of revolution, were not happy with this and felt that, this was what do they call it, a labor aristocracy. That workers in the West weren't really the drivers of the kind of change they wanted to see. And so they pivoted very much towards, well, the students are the vanguard of a kind of leftist political practice or of a revolution. And of course, that was horribly naive. And we continue to see that tendency on the left. But what that means is that, labor parties used to be made up of, to some degree, people that worked in factories, people that, knew what supply chains were, people that, knew how to machine a part. And that's completely absent now. And so, the term engineering discipline is become one that I use often, but the left has completely lost any sense of engineering discipline just because of who makes it up. It retreated into the academy. It's mostly folks in, the social sciences and humanities now that are sort of developing these thoughts. And frankly, on a sort of political party level, environmentalists have become incredibly influential in leadership. One has to look no further than the role of Gina McCarthy in the Biden administration. She's a former NRDC chairperson. And in my country, the Prime Minister's office, 3 of the 4 key staffers around the Prime Minister from the World Wildlife Fund. I mean, there's a real disconnect from the real world and from the workplace. And I think that's lamentable as someone, myself, who still holds a lot of progressive values around, universal access to non-commodity things like healthcare and water and housing and things like that. It's a shame for me to see that happen to sort of my side of the political aisle or political spectrum. And I've been a bit of a a bit of a heretic, I guess, for swimming in some of the waters I do, for having some of the people I have on my podcast. But, if the engineering discipline and the understanding of energy is a much stronger on the right, I'm happy to speak to people on the political right. So I don't know, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a complex question. I mean, there's a lot of issues with the, like the environmental aspect that's infiltrated policy. There's people that are caring people like you. Clearly, you're in the medicine field, like I mentioned. And I think these ideas attract people that have deep empathy. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good human trait to have. I think, unfortunately, the other thing that happens a lot, in my opinion, in today's day and age is that we're just a soundbite culture. It's much easier to hear answers that are not nuanced, that are very clean cut, especially when they're coming from like the top people, right? When the top political leaders or the top, voices say these things and they sound, like this is good, this is bad. And people want to go to work every day. They've got kids they got to feed. They're trying to just live their life, and they're good people and they have empathy. And then that empathy, and then they see these sound bites and these things that they're being told from these figures that are telling them these things, and they think, okay, this is truth, right? Whereas it's much more complicated, and both sides do it. I mean, I'm not saying it's just on the one side. I think that that's a symptom of it. The other symptom that I think is really strange is just like we're kind of going at it and playing these questions, but as we're talking about it, the other thing I think is really strange is just like this hardcore being against something and then using it every day. Like that's the thing that's always just blown my mind about the just fossil fuels have to be eliminated, and they're like just using it all the time. Like I can't think of anything else like that that's stark of a what you say versus what you do thing. It's just really, it's crazy. I don't know if you ever
it's
thought
incredible.
about that.
I mean, you probably saw the image of some protesters in Europe. I'm not sure whose painting it was they were vandalizing, but they threw a bunch of, I think it was mashed potatoes or something on a painting, and then said like, no more fossil fuels. People are starving around the world. And, obviously what they don't recognize is that, natural gas is the feedstock in the Haber-Bosch process to create synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And half the world's population would starve if we didn't have that source of nitrogen. There's an incredible failure, particularly kind of within the decadent West, to educate its youth about, the bedrocks of our civilization and our society. And, in terms of the kind of climate youth culture, the Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future folks, I find it so depressing because we are in a moment of incredible challenges, both climate and energy. But what's needed is not a response of, tune in and drop out, like a kind of Timothy O'Leary drop some acid in the 60s response. It's study your fucking asses off, get a profession, get a specialty so that you can contribute to society, right? Go get an engineering degree, whatever it is, right? I think we're going to need a lot of STEM. We're going to need a lot of frankly, apprenticeships and blue collar labor for the kind of ambitions that our societies have, even independent from energy, just geopolitically in terms of friendshoring and reshoring industry, reversing kind of what we've done, crippling ourselves with exporting so much of our critical supply chains to unfriendly countries. There's a lot of work to do. And so, I tell those kids, go ahead and strike on Friday, but study on Saturday. Right. Make something of yourselves. And fundamentally, I don't know. I did a Myers-Briggs personality test once. I forget what my kind of letters are. It's like ENJFP, whatever. I forget the letters, but the key thing that struck me was like my personality trait. The core driver is to help others flourish and bloom. Like nothing gives me greater satisfaction than assisting someone else on their journey to becoming essentially all they can be. It sounds really cheesy, right? But like kind of a coaching mentality. And I do that a lot in my personal relations and in my mentorship of, both medical students and folks in advocacy. But that's the kind of frustrated impulse I feel towards these misguided youth fucking desecrating, some great artworks. But yeah, absolutely. There's this horrible hypocrisy. And it's a failure. It's an enormous failure that we have, I think, in the kind of decadent Western world and these wealthy societies. We've failed to educate our youth again on just the basics of how society functions. And I'll go back to Václav Smil over and over again, but his most recent book, How the World Really Works, we're book clubbing it right now. Decouple, we've started another little venture called Decouple Reads, but just a vital piece of information and Václav's most digestible piece of writing yet.
It's good. Yeah. I've read a couple of his. That one was good. I finished it. It's great. I mean, like there's this chart that sticks out, and I think that the biggest thing, and I listened to one of your episodes where you talked about Alex Epstein's new book, and he does a good job of like contrasting the pros and the cons. He's not always like so good about talking about the cons. I think with climate, he glosses over some things, but the pro and the cons, right? With energy, that's all it is. It's a trade-off. And like if you look at like, there's this chart that Václav Smil has, and it's the craziest chart ever, and it's basically like hydrocarbon usage as a fuel, and then it's like human life, it's like population on Earth, and the lines just go completely straight up together. And so it's like some guy was in my comments the other day being like, fossil fuels have killed more people than Stalin and Mao. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but check this chart out. Like, like it's a net. You have to look at the net here. Like everything's got, issues. It doesn't mean we can't get better and cleaner. It just means we have to weigh the trade-offs. And so we can go into this conversation. This is what I wanted to do maybe more at the end, but we talked a little bit earlier today before the episode. And I think it's fascinating, your recent trip. And you had a picture with Justin Trudeau. And then you also had talked about, which he's an interesting guy. I won't go too hard on it right now, but you talked about the nuclear advocacy stuff, which I think is great. And maybe talk a little bit how you got into that and some of the gains that you guys have had, because I know you've had some wins. And then let's talk about this hydrogen stuff that just got recently announced. I think it's fascinating, some of your takes on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, you're talking about pros and cons and trade-offs. And we've talked about the political divide as well. And I think, why I'm so excited about nuclear and why I advocate for it passionately is because it can really bridge those divides and really minimize those trade-offs. On the political front, nuclear answers questions for basically every faction, amongst the environmentalists, if they really did care about the environment. It's the ultimate form of, cleaning up our air by displacing more polluting sources. Again, the challenge is not to create clean energy. I keep saying this, right? We need to replace fossil fuel services, not make copious clean energy. And that's the failure of the European Union. They didn't understand or frankly put any respect on the name of coal or gas, and thought they could replace it by something that just doesn't provide those services of affordability, reliability, dispatchability, et cetera.
Nor is it ever really intended to, right? I mean, it's a supplemental thing. I'm not saying it doesn't ever have a use case, but I think it was labeled as something that it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think even the use case is debatable. I mean, there's a kind of taxonomy of in energy, I think, that I'm coming up with to describe attitudes towards nuclear and renewables. But certainly, I'm fitting in this sort of nuke bro category. Again, I think of broery as a way of behaving to people, not a set of opinions, but we get pigeonholed there for being pro-nuclear and generally quite opposed to non-dispatchable or weather-dependent resources. But we'll get into that later. Just to kind of finish that thought, though, about the way that nuclear can appeal across the political aisle. So, I mean, its climate credentials are absolutely impeccable. The UN Economic Commission of Europe releasing its most recent study on life cycle emissions, and nuclear's 5-6 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Again, compared to natural gas at about 450 and coal at 1,000. It's just off the charts, and it's about 10 times lower than solar and half that of wind. And in terms of, for those on the traditional left or those that, profess to care about working class people or labor, nuclear offers a just transition. If we are talking about trying to minimize fossil fuel use or transition, say from coal to nuclear, you give people who have good jobs. Frankly, I mean, jobs in the fossil fuel industry tend to be pretty well paying, pretty high skills. And we have the example where I come from right here in Ontario, where we phased out our coal fleet using nuclear energy. And, one of my good friends is a kind of hero of that process. He went from being an operator at the largest coal plant in North America at Nanticoke to now working at the largest nuke plant in the world, about 100 kilometers north, the Bruce Power Station. So for the kind of labor left, there's very good sort of just transition arguments. And then, for the right, energy is what underpins, our whole economy. As Alex Epstein says, it's the secret ingredient in everything. Even folks on the sort of free market fundamentalist side who think that, government shouldn't be involved, and yes, nuclear does need some stewardship from government, have to realize that, the experience of Europe, I think, is so instructive. If you screw up your energy system, then your whole economy goes to shit. You don't have a pro-business environment anymore. So, for me, as someone who kind of comes from a left or even a hard left background, it's exciting to find a tool that can be a political unifier. And I think that's what's kind of made me so passionate about it. And yeah, I had quite a little rip in Ottawa this last week. I was referred into the media as a lobbying spree. I actually don't take any money for the work I do, so I don't have to register as a lobbyist. I'm an advocate. But I had a number of great meetings with members of both of the main political parties. In Canada, we have the Liberals, who are in power, and the Conservatives, who are in opposition. And I met Justin Trudeau, the man himself, and told him that his government has to sort itself out because they have a very contradictory approach to nuclear energy, frankly, a pretty hostile one. And so I was able to bend his ear a bit on that, which was useful. There's a big divide in his party on this, so it was interesting to work into that divide and try and arm the side of it that has some logic and reason. And of course, talking with the opposition has some very fruitful discussions. So, it's been quite a meteoric rise, this nuclear advocacy pursuit. It started 2 years ago with us setting out some folding tables in one of the public squares in Canada's largest city, some homemade pamphlets, and 2.5 years later, I'm glad handling the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers, and I think having a big impact. And as you mentioned, we saved a nuclear plant as well. So things are going real well.
That's huge. No, and I want to stop here before we talk about hydrogen stuff, because you said a lot of interesting things. I want to talk about them. One thing you said about kind of bridging the gap or bringing people together on both sides. I think that the interesting thing is that as somebody from the fossil fuel industry, natural gas and oil, I relate to the nuclear side, and maybe it's because it's my doing the energy podcast and diving into these topics so much, but I just see the benefits of it, and I can game theory into the future because I've thought about these problems a lot, and I have 3 sons of my own, and whether it be climate or whether it just be a good economy in a country that's prosperous and has the ability to be a great country, I see nuclear as playing a critical role. It's been a lot of negative things have happened to it over the years. And you mentioned government needing to be involved. It'll probably always have to be involved, primarily from the safety and security aspect of it. I think that there's a misconception, in my opinion, that government has to be involved because of the cost side and all these things. If you look at the cost of these plants, like 50% or something is financing costs because of the continually changing regulations. And so this is very much government that's causing them to be that expensive. Because, if it takes 10 years and it was supposed to take 4 years or 5 years, you've doubled the amount of interest on a massive multi-billion-dollar loan, and now it's a $20 billion project. So the government will be involved because of the safety side, but in terms of private capital could do this, right? I mean, if the government just said, hey, get it done in 4 years, we're going to back all the debt so they can't default, I'm sure we could build a ton of these plants in 4 years. If we took the 300-something billion that we just spent on electric charging stations for EVs that'll never be used because people charge at their house, or that wasn't all used for that, I'm exaggerating, but that whole new Green Deal that they just did, it's like that could 30% down on $1 trillion nuke fleet. We could probably add 20-30% to the US's energy mix over the next 10 years and greenlight everything, make it go fast. And guess what? Like, if you're a fossil fuels bro and somebody who's into this industry, it's not going away. Like, you still need natural gas, you still need petrochemicals, you still need all these things, right? And so nuclear, I think, is something that just has to happen long term. Fossil fuels are a finite resource. It's going to be around for my lifetime. I'm not worried about it. It's going to be around for my kids' lifetime too. I don't have to sit here and advocate for it because it ain't going away. But if you really want to care about the future, nuclear just makes too much sense. And I think in this day and age, things that make too much sense are often the things that the politicians don't do, for whatever reason. And I've got some questions about that later. So I do think weirdly, it seems like on Twitter, at least, fossil fuel people and nuclear people seem to be coming together quite frequently, it seems like, at least over the last year or so. I don't know if you're seeing that, but I am.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think fossil fuel people get energy. They understand it. They understand how the sausage gets made. I think, the analogy I have for, again, the folks that are kind of climate concerned but don't study energy, it's kind of like the 14-year-old city kid who has only ever their only relationship to food is going to the grocery store, right?
Right.
And then they become shocked when they learn that chicken came, that piece of meat, that breast came from a chicken. And then they go vegetarian because they're just freaking out about it because they've never been to a fucking farm. They've never, planted something or, pulled up a carrot or whatever, right? Like, that's a very similar attitude. What you're talking about in terms of, we have all these charging stations now. That's as far as a lot of these politicians can imagine energy, right? It's just the kind of end use application. And there's no appreciation for the power plants that are going to provide the juice to run those things. And it's really sort of tragic and short-sighted. And, I talk a lot about how the climate movement and environmentalists are just really good at scoring own goals, right?
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to their anti-nuclear agenda. You have to look no farther than, really any nuclear closure in the States. Even the plants that were being built and then were stopped or converted into coal plants, but more recently plants like Indian Point that were shut down and replaced by natural gas or other fossil fuels. Germany, for instance, I mean, they have built a lot of wind and solar. They've transitioned for their backup from coal. I mean, still burning a lot of coal, but towards gas. And now that gas is squeezed, they're moving back to coal in a big way. They just announced they're opening 5 of their mothballed lignite plants, for God's sake.
Yeah.
So, we gotta get, beyond the grocery store and go and spend some time on the farm, basically, in order to understand it better. I mean, preach, brother. You said a lot of great things there, but in terms of that alliance, or at least allied ways of looking at things, yeah, of course. It's because I think there's a realism there to understanding how the world works, and an interest in understanding that, and not just engaging in unicorn fart fantasies. Not to get too crass about it.
Yeah, but that's what gets frustrating. It's like people are like, "Oh, you're anti-renewables." I'm like, "No, I'm just anti things that like aren't real. They're like the claims that are made, right? Like it's not that like." Look, I live in Oklahoma. We have a ton of wind energy. There's a ton of wind in Oklahoma. If you ever come here, it's like, it's the windiest place you ever, super windy all the time. It's annoying. It's probably the most annoying thing about our weather. And we got a lot of annoying things about our weather. But it makes sense. There are some wind farms here, and there are times during the day or during, the energy generation cycle where we're 40% whatever wind. But the thing that makes that work is that like we have tons of really cheap natural gas here in state. We have a very well interconnected grid with the Southwest Power Pool, and we're just super interconnected. And then we have a ton of there's cheap coal too, right? So we have like all the things that make it make sense. But the reality is the wind probably wouldn't have been put in without all the tax, the subsidies and the tax breaks and credits and all these things anyways. So I'm not saying that like there isn't ever an application for renewables. I think sometimes areas have to look at what they naturally have. And I think you have to view these things as a supplemental energy source, which is how I think how they're intended to be. And when I get like hostile with people is when I just see stuff that's just like not true. And they're like promoting it as true. Like, hey, like some guy on Twitter went viral yesterday with like 8,000 likes. And he's like, by 2035, we're going to be 100% renewables in all of Europe, and all it takes is $100 something billion investment. And I'm like, no, that's just not true. Like you're not going to be 100% renewables, and it's not going to take that investment.
But listen to you, Max. You've been taken in by an industry with an incredible marketing and public relations arm. You're using the word renewables. Does that term make any sense to you? Right.
No,
it describes things as different as, the Drax plant in the UK. It's like, was their largest coal plant retrofitted to burning biomass, which, eats up forests as far away as, the Carolinas, even the west coast of Canada. They ship wood pellets, from primary forests from British Columbia, right? Just north of the state of Washington, across my whole country, ship it across the Atlantic in these, bunker fuel burning cargo ships. Put it in trains and burn it in a fucking retrofitted coal plant. And that gets carbon credits and avoids any sort of regulation in that regard, right? So that's
like one of the biggest scandals. Shouldn't that be one of the biggest scandals? And like you see it on Twitter, but where is anybody else talking about this?
Absolutely. So we have to like reclaim the language, I think, and not fall prey to using the marketing terms that have kind of been foisted upon us. Because renewables includes that. It includes something that's very useful, large scale hydro, absolutely an amazing decarbonization tool, something that provides, life-giving energy in many, many countries around the world. If you're lucky enough to have the resources, it includes geothermal, which again is, reliable and dispatchable. Right. And also these other resources like wind and solar, which frankly, I think there is a role, but I think it's pretty limited to sort of off-grid areas. There's very, maybe if you have amazing solar resources and you use a little bit because it matches your supply curve really well in terms of, air conditioning, maybe in Australia. They've clearly overbuilt, but, there may be a small role here or there. But, it's not because I fetishize the technology or I just really don't like, wind turbines or solar panels. We have to set goals, right? What are we trying to achieve? I think we're all pretty big fans of having clean air to breathe. I think we're all pretty big fans of, if there are some harms of climate change coming, trying to minimize those. Shit. Sorry, 1 second.
No worries. No, you're right. Nobody wants a dirty, look around. Like things are clean where I live. I'm sure the things are clean where you live. Nobody wants a dirty planet. Even in the oil and gas industry, no one's like, we want polluted air.
Yeah. And there's, in terms of other goals, we want high quality jobs and employment. We want a thriving society, and, wind and solar in particular. Let's take those out of this so-called renewables bag and have a deep look at them. Like nowhere in the world have wind and solar resulted in deep decarbonization. We've run the largest experiment in the world in Germany, where they've spent over 550 billion euros on a wind and solar dominated transition. Before the Russian invasion, they were using coal for the number one source of electricity on their grid. There was an extreme weather event in Europe. Did you hear about it? It wasn't a hurricane. It was called a wind drought, right?
Yeah.
So a massive uptick in coal. So it had, and in California as well. I mean, they're burning more gas than ever. This is not a deep decarbonization tool. It fails at that simple goal. And of course, that fits along with air pollution. But one of the, again, from this kind of labor commitment past that I have, this idea of a just transition is important to me. If people in fossil fuel industry are gonna transition into other jobs in so-called clean energy, those better be good jobs. And I've talked to some academics that study this area, and they say, well, yeah, I mean, the wind and solar jobs don't pay as well, but, and I say, just stop right there. Right. That's not a just transition. Like, you can't expect people that have mortgages to pay and families to feed to say, I'm going to do the right thing for the climate and take a 50%, pay cut, or accept a job which, is really only in construction and it takes me far away from my family because we're just building these things in the middle of nowhere, these wind farms and solar farms. I mean, there's a great piece in Vice recently. I'm forgetting the name of the journalist, but she followed around a number of solar panel installers. And I mean, their working conditions are horrific. Yeah, they're out in the middle of nowhere, slapping up these panels, getting paid absolute garbage because it's a very low skill job, right? It doesn't require any kind of education or training beyond, running a drill and fastening these things onto their attachments in the ground. So, I have a hostility to wind and solar in particular because I think they're wrecking our society. I mean, they've wrecked Europe. And even from a more sort of geopolitical front, I mean, China must be just delighted that we're fragilizing our civilizational, life support structure, our grid, with these resources. Which
but China's installing the most solar panels and windmills of anyone, Chris.
Yeah, and I mean, it may be because it helps. Like they have a fossil fuel crunch, right? They import something like 80% of their fossil fuels, particularly petroleum, right? Renewables can help you spare some fuels. They don't ever replace the need for a 100% backup capacity, but they can spare you some fuel burning. So potentially China's doing that, pursuing some wind and solar deployment for that reason. But also, I mean, if you're trying to convince the rest of the world to do something really stupid, you kind of have to do it in your own country as well.
Yeah, maybe they're just full of shit like everything else that they do, and they lie about their numbers, and they lie about the viability of their tech, and they lie about all the other things because nothing that comes out of China is true, except for apparently all their green energy goals. That's the only thing. You can look at it no matter what it is. COVID, I mean, name a thing. They lie about everything, except for you just get these staunch advocates saying they are the leaders in green. And I'm like, I guess, maybe. I mean, it's because we're buying all the stuff from them. Like you said, it's like if we want to rely on domestic energy, and I know we have to source uranium from different places. People want to say it's all from Russia. It's not. There's plenty of places. I think Canada is like double-digit percentage maybe of uranium supply. So there's places to get it. And then once you have it, it's easy to store. And then you have decades worth of power that you can generate. And it gives a lot of sovereignty there. Whereas renewables, you're just kind of reliant on a much more complex supply chain, primarily driven by China, who is not really anybody's friend, including their own people, if you had asked me. But anyways, it's just like, it's one of those things. I'm glad you're being more openly hostile. I didn't know how hostile you were towards renewables, but you're making all the points that need to be said. I mean, the reality is that like, I try not to be too openly hostile about it because I try to have an open mind. But as I have an open mind and I hear the arguments, they're just not very good arguments. And then you see, and beyond the arguments, you just see the outcomes of it, right? Like you said, there's an experiment that's been run. It's called Germany. We can look at that, right? It's beyond the thesis stage. And it's getting to we actually have results. We can measure those. And so I'm going to shift this to the hydrogen topic. And I think this is a good segue to that. What are the incentives? Why are these renewables being pushed? Not because of we talked about the people that the ideology makes it make sense for them, but at the political level, when you have, for example, Canada, who's got just vast quantities, hundreds of years at least of natural gas. And then you have Germany and these countries in Europe that need natural gas and are, getting it from a dictator in Vladimir Putin. Why then, when they have these meetings, are they talking about things like wind energy powering hydrogen? And why is so much renewables getting pushed? Why is the narrative from politicians that we have to change everything and all this new money has to be put in? I'm leading you, but why do you think these decisions get made like this? Oh, I lost you. Did it freeze?
Just for a second. I think we're back.
Okay, cool. There you go. Did you hear me?
Yeah. I mean, listen, our Prime Minister was asked about, developing our LNG export capacity to Europe and Germany in particular. He said there's no business case. we have landlocked gas. Henry Hub, I'm not sure where it's at today. I think it's $7 or $8, right? I think
a little cheaper, back down to $5, but
down to $5.
Soldier season, it's going to come back.
I'm going to trust you on that for sure. Over in Europe, what are we at? $50?
Maybe. It's a lot higher. Yeah.
Yeah. In Canada, we're landlocked. We're probably $4 or $3 right now. I'm not sure. But there's apparently no business case for sending LNG to our allies. So listen, I mean, the government that's in power, the Liberal Party, they're very much a focus group party. And a good chunk of their base is very climate concerned and environmentalist. And as I said, the Prime Minister's office has at least 2 of its staff members are former World Wildlife Fund functionaries. So there's a strong sort of environmentalist underpinning to the decision making that's occurring. I do think that this government will deploy LNG. It's going to take a bit longer, but they don't want to piss off their climate concern base. So they're virtue signaling and cloaking it in something called the Canada-Germany Hydrogen Alliance. And, when I first heard about this, I thought it was maybe a joke, but what they're planning is to build an enormous amount of offshore wind and onshore wind on our East Coast, the equivalent of the entire wind fleet in Canada right now. Hook all of those wind turbines up to electrolyzers, split water into H2, and then use the Haber-Bosch process to turn it into ammonia, ship it across the Atlantic Ocean, and then either burn it directly as ammonia or turn it back into hydrogen to burn as hydrogen mixed in with natural gas in Germany. And if that took me a while to explain, and that sounds like a lot of, energy conversions, well, it's because it is.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not very efficient. I just did a great episode with an Australian, he's an electrical engineer, but he's worked mostly in oil and gas in his life and knows a lot of combustion engineers and things like that. And we ran through the numbers and the processes. And before the shipping side of things, it's 22% efficient. Before shipping it across the Atlantic, before, maybe turning it back into hydrogen over in Germany.
So 22% recovery, when you say efficient, you mean like 80 something, like, yeah. Okay. So 78% not efficient, I guess.
Exactly. And listen, the end point is for Germany to burn ammonia, and you can't just burn ammonia at low temperatures, apparently. You have to burn ammonia in a high temperature furnace. So that's basically going to be a gas plant or a coal plant. And currently where it's being trialed in Japan, it's in a coal plant, and it's basically gives a bit of an afterburner effect by squirting it into some of the hot gases at the end of your combustion cycle in a coal plant, and just getting every last hydrocarbon to oxidize, right? So you're burning fertilizer in a coal plant, and that's supposed to be green. Yeah. And that's in the midst of a enormous fertilizer crisis and shortage, and likely localized areas of famine around the world popping up as that lack of fertilizer starts to impact things, and as the invasion of Ukraine has interrupted wheat exports and potash exports, etc. So it's like, it's not environmental, clearly. And, we didn't talk about this again. There's so many things to comment about with wind and solar, but I mean, they're materially very intensive. Something like 15% of global primary energy goes into mining and milling and in the process of building our material world. And wind and solar are just so materially inefficient. They're so energy dilute. There's something like 60,000 pounds of copper in every wind turbine. There's 200 tons of steel in a 2 megawatt wind turbine. Something like 200 tons of cement. Yeah. Fossil fuel residues for the blades of the wind turbine. I mean, Václav Smil, again, not to over reference him, but he refers to them as kind of monuments to the fossil fuel industry, because without them, you don't have these devices. So it's completely nonsensical. And, again, who pays in the end? International capital doesn't build energy infrastructure and take huge risks, right? They're looking for this to be backed up. And, you guys had your Inflation Reduction Act announced and voted on last month, maybe 2 months ago. I've just got word that Canada is working on a kind of answer to that policy, and it's going to involve something like a 30% production tax credit, and even outright grants to eligible projects, which are mostly going to be wind and solar. And so they're gonna finance and back up this, probably, again, when you factor in the shipping and the chemical conversions on the German side, this might actually be a net energy loss.
Right.
But this is what's going to be financed. And of course, there's winners and losers. The production tax credit. There's a famous Warren Buffett quote saying that we build these wind farms for the production tax credit. Without the tax credit, they don't make sense. And what does that mean? It means that large investment banks can avoid paying taxes. And like taxes or not, your roads are paved with taxes, your bridges are maintained with taxes. In Canada, your healthcare is, delivered to you because of some taxes that we all pay. You're undermining the very fabric of civilization to pursue a form of energy production, which is just nonsensical. And again, it's not environmental. In no way, shape, or form is it environmental to bang up 6 megawatt wind turbines all over the coast of one of our beautiful maritime provinces, to run, hundreds of large ammonia tankers every year across the Atlantic, and lastly, to burn it in a coal plant. It makes no sense.
No, I'll just tell you my answer to this question. If it was asked to me, it's corruption, in my opinion. The thing about the energy transition is that, and we mentioned this again on the talk we just did briefly earlier today, but that basically insinuates that we have to tear everything down and build this new thing. We have to completely transition from what we have. Well, we have zero carbon energy. We have nuclear. We have low carbon energy sources like natural gas, that we need these things. We need that anyways, because it makes everything that we use day to day. So why are they then pushing this narrative that's going to cost taxpayers billions, probably hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, and that is going to basically involve this huge amount of industrialization where they are in effect picking the winners and losers? And you said, well, they don't want to piss off their green base. Well, yeah, sure, they don't want to piss them off, and they're not reading beyond the headlines. So, this looks good to them. But more than that, they want to, reward the people that got them elected in these special interest groups that are going to benefit, in my opinion, because people will make it on Twitter. They're like, these people are either dumb or they're trying to purposely, destroy the world. And I'm like, it's neither one of those. They're not dumb and they're not trying to destroy the world. They're just trying to make a lot of money and make the people that got them elected a lot of money. And those are the same people that are going to pay them tons of money to go give speeches and write the book and do all these things afterwards. And so all these public politician people, they're worth tens of millions of dollars, or hundreds of millions of dollars. And the way that they get worth that is that they pad the pockets of special interests. And it happens on both sides. The problem is that when it's happening in this debate, in this realm, there's real world consequences like human lives suffering and the world becoming more unstable. And, just basically a teardown of prosperity. And it would be something that, like Doomberg always says, is if our enemies had to design the strategy, they would tell us to do this. Right. Yeah. So that's where it's the problem. It's not that both sides don't do these kind of things. It's the stuff that they're pushing forward. It has real world consequences. That's my opinion why they're pushing for this crazy wind farm hydrogen thing that you just explained is probably corruption, if I had to guess.
We've just come off of a pretty good decade, right? Energy was historically low in cost. Capital was historically low. Interest rates were some of the lowest that we've really seen, going back to Roman times, for God's sake. Yeah. In terms of the availability of capital. And so, we were able, I think, to entertain some of these fantasies and do things that just made no thermodynamic sense. We're in different times now. We're into a really tough decade. Some places worse than others. Europe is facing, real deindustrialization of its remaining, strong economies like Germany. And like it or not, it's that industrial base that holds up the rest of a generous society that, pays free tuition for its students or issues arts grants or, all of the things that are the nice frills of a rich society and civilization. Those are being chipped away at. And it's all falling apart very quickly. And we face our own pressures, even in North America, where we're a little more insulated from those price shocks, where we weren't dependent upon, petro dictators like Putin. But we don't have the luxury to make these kind of mistakes anymore. And so that's why I really push back against folks who are in the kind of all of the above camp. There's a real it's actually very Canadian. I'm surprised to see it in the US amongst some thinkers, but the all of the above approach to sort of clean energy, quote unquote, clean energy, where we don't really want to have debates and, really pick a winner based upon some tough criteria. There's enough room for everybody in their pet technology, right? So we got to build a bit of wind, got to build a bit of solar. Sure, we'll even let you build a little nuclear plant in our sandbox, right? We don't have time for that kind of immaturity anymore and that kind of child's play. These are hard and tough times, and we need to respond in a way that is, informed and that meets our goals. And again, that's what really brings me back to nuclear over and over and over again. It's not an easy thing to do. Fossil fuels aren't easy either, to be frank, but nuclear is tough. And it's tough because it's up against decades and decades and decades of misinformation, and frankly, some very real fear dating back to the Cold War period. It's when I try and understand, and I do try and be empathetic, because I think the best way to win an argument is to really get inside your opponent's head. And the boomer generation, folks like my dad who did duck and cover drills hiding under their desks in school, I mean, they have a real reason to fear anything that sounds like nuclear. The irony is that the great threat of our parents' generation was, nuclear annihilation from war. I mean, maybe that's gonna rear its head again. If the next great threat or challenge is climate change, bizarrely, the solution is also a nuclear technology solution, but it's the peaceful application, the peaceful use of the atom. So yeah, man, I mean, I keep bringing it back to this, but you talk about spending, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. How do we spend that money? And right now, with things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the version of it that we're going to develop here in Canada, essentially it's, we're going to generate an epic trade deficit. We're going to buy finished products from China. 7 of the 10 largest wind companies are now in China. The US wind companies are hugely distressed because they've been signing contracts, assuming a very low, assuming decreasing costs. And there's been a big reversal in the last couple of years. 97% of the world's solar wafers come out of China. So we'd be sending hundreds of billions of dollars to China, importing finished products, big trade deficit, and then, low skilled labor slapping these things up. And then they would produce power that's intermittent, unreliable, expensive. And that undermines, again, our civilizational support structure, our grid. And people don't understand like how vital electricity is. It's like air in the modern world to a modern civilization. Right. The blackouts we think about are, I kind of call them like your mom's blackouts, like a tree falls on a line and, a line's crew comes along and gets it back up in a few hours. And it was kind of fun. You got to read by candlelight for a few hours. Like we're talking about something entirely different, particularly if we pursue an electrify everything agenda with technologies that are unreliable and intermittent. So, there's a lot at stake here, and it's not about like, why can't we all just get along and, each of us get to sort of use our pet technologies. We need to have a sober analysis of what's happening in the world, what our challenges are, and then deploy the technologies that will meet our needs.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really good. And I think you're exactly right. It's interesting to hear you attack the all of the above camp, because I feel like that's kind of this pacifist. They're trying to pacify both sides and be like, well, like you see it a lot, like in the capital allocators, like these, I was pretty close with a lot of the energy private equity companies. At one point we had a private equity backed entity, and like I'd met a lot of these guys, and you saw them, particularly in like 2019, 2020, really pivot and go more towards this narrative that you're talking about, which is like, oh, we're going to be accommodative, and we're going to, raise money, which that was the key phrase there, to do the energy transition. Well, they just saw it as another way to get money in, to take advantage of these programs. They saw that the government was leaning that way after Trump came out of office, and they said, oh, we'll go raise these multi-billion-dollar funds to go deploy this capital. And the funny thing is, you talk to these guys, they don't know what to spend it on. Like none of it really makes money. And they're kind of like, they're really struggling, I think, to find ways to even deploy it. And then the irony is, it's like you're pushing them to be like, hey, why don't we just like reduce carbon in the oil field? Like, why don't we, like we had a project that was going to reduce the equivalent. It was like a electric compression project. And it was going to reduce the equivalent of like 750 Teslas on the road per annual for one of these units. And we were going to deploy hundreds of them. So like basically we were going to buy this company, and we could show that this is going to literally blow Tesla out of the water. We're going to be like 10x Tesla by next year in terms of the amount of emissions that we're reducing. And the LPs, which mind you, these are people that are, if it's a teacher's pension plan, they're actual teachers on the board. If it's the whatever welders union, there's welders on the board. And they're like, no, that's greenwashing. That's greenwashing. Y'all are pumping oil out of the ground. It's like, we're going to reduce 10x the emissions of Tesla. And if the oil doesn't get pumped here, it's going to get pumped in the Middle East, right? And so you try to bring these rational decisions. It's like, hey, why don't we just do what works and get better at it? And it's not resonating. And one of the main arguments is kind of that thing that you just said, like hey, it's all the above. We're gonna help pacify these people over here. And to your point, it just doesn't seem real productive, and it leads to this like hydrogen thing, which just has scam written all over it to me. I mean, it's not going to work, number one, and number two, it's going to be, I think, disastrous. And I think maybe if you really dug into it, you could probably draw some pretty, if not bright lines, but at least dotted lines to some of these decision makers and some pretty big conflicts of interest, if I had to guess.
And I mean, that's what we were documenting on my most recent podcast. There's evidence that the premier and his father of Newfoundland. So kind of like the governor of one of our provinces, went on a luxury fishing trip with a billionaire, John Risley, who made his fortune in seafood and is now a major investor in GH2, a big hydrogen consortium, which is, planning on building this enormous wind park to take part in this Canadian-German hydrogen alliance. That's not definitive proof, but shortly after that fishing trip, Newfoundland dropped its moratorium on onshore wind turbines, about a month later. So there's definitely questions being asked. And from what I understand, those fishing trips weren't just with provincial politicians. So, again, when something is this thermodynamically unviable, there's got to be some dirt behind it. I mean, that's certainly my intuition. And I do, and anticipate and look forward to more dirt emerging on this, because again, we just can't afford to make these kind of idiotic mistakes in a time of scarcity, in a time of runaway inflation, in a time when, everyday people are hurting. This is a misallocation of capital. So it's not all of the above. We have to do what's effective. I'm pretty bullish on Canadian nuclear. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that, nuclear is the ultimate economic development tool, particularly in Canada, where we have, some of the world's best uranium reserves. We have our own technology, the CANDU heavy water reactor, and a supply chain, which is all here. It's 96% made in Canada. So when we invest a dollar in this technology, we get $1.40 back in GDP activity, because none of it leaves the country as it would if we were to buy wind and solar tech and just become a country of wind and solar installers. So, there's some pretty powerful incentives there. And in terms of, again, just, in hard times, doing what we need to for the economy, we get to also harvest the clean air, climate benefits. And what do you know? Our CANDU reactors also make, enormous amount of the world's medical isotopes, which enable, sterile, modern healthcare. But again, nuclear is hard. The degree to which it requires government intervention, I think, is debatable, but certainly an anti-nuclear government can do a huge amount of damage to nuclear, again, because of the regulatory hurdles that it faces. But, from a finance perspective, like I was up in Ottawa speaking to the opposition party, they're much more pro-nuclear. The challenge with them is that they're, very free market fundamentalists, and they say, we want to have a no new spending government. And you can understand that. We definitely, I guess there's diversity of opinion in terms of the kind of relief spending that happened during COVID, but we definitely, quantitatively eased and spent a lot of money that we probably didn't have. But, again, with energy, it's just too important to leave this affair completely to the market. And if you have a sound industrial policy in Canada that centers nuclear energy, then you get to harvest this enormous economic multiplier effect. So, it's an issue, again, that I think is just really fun to advocate for, especially as I was up on Parliament Hill last week, because you get nodding heads, from every single political party, and you realize I just said the exact same thing to the last guy.
Yeah.
So, it's a cool topic.
It's a cool topic, and I think it's very worthwhile to advocate for. When you go into the rabbit hole of nuclear, there's a lot of things that we have to overcome. And to me, one of the biggest things is just like the lack of, talent and the drain that it's had, the lack of the contractors that even know how to build these things. There's so many issues, and it's part of this kind of like negative feedback loop where you don't build reactors anymore. You lose people that are interested in getting nuclear engineering degrees. You lose companies that are focused on this. You lose everything probably from insurance to, there's a whole supply chain involved and a whole industry, right, that needs to be rebuilt. And it's not as simple as like, hey, let's just go give funding to nuclear power plants because who's going to build them? Where are you going to, there's just so many dominoes that have fallen over the years because it's been torn down. The industry has, and all these plants have been shuttered, and it's going to take a lot. And I think it starts at the public perception level, which I think that's changing, or at least it feels like it's changing because of people like you. The politicians have to be on board. But if we had the political will, I think we could get it done. it's just going to be a lot harder because of how much it's regressed. I mean, am I reading that wrong? But that's, as much as I've dug into it, it seems like there's a broader issue. It's not like we can just do it. There's a lot that needs to happen.
No, you're absolutely right, Max. And, this is something that I kind of joke about, or I've come up with this term, and it's called the nuclear secret sauce. Because clearly throughout history, country after country has succeeded at deploying nuclear reactors on budget and on time. And, down where you guys are, south of my border, the 1960s and early 70s were a heyday. I mean, you guys were building reactors in 4 or 5 years. They were cost competitive with coal, sometimes cheaper than coal, right? And then it's kind of like it was a relay race and the baton got passed elsewhere. In Canada, we did great building nuclear in the 70s and 80s. In France, 80s and 90s were a boom time. They knocked up 54 reactors in 20 years, right? Yeah. Japan, 90s, South Korea, the 2000s, China right now. And so, when you're talking about reinventing the wheel, I think you really have to understand what were the circumstances that came together to enable those nuclear flourishing moments. And, again, why I'm really bullish on Canadian nuclear is that we have a lot of, the ingredients that I've identified in the secret sauce. So, I mean, what are those? You've identified 2 of them that are really important. It's the human factors. It's having people who know how to build these things, right? Who have construction and project managing experience. Supply chains are vital as well, right? I mean, we're a lot of different parts going to a nuclear plant. And some of the big issues at Vogtle, for instance, were, sure, it was going to be this modular design that would snap together like Lego, but some of the Lego blocks showed up and they didn't fit together. The dimensions were off by like 6 or 10 inches, which is actually a big issue. Right back to the factory and bang out another modular component and set the project back by 6 years or 12 months, or pour the concrete wrong and jackhammer it all out. So not easy things to do. So, supply chain and human factors is absolutely massive. Having a design that you're familiar with, that you know how to build and operate, is really important. We have that in Canada with the CANDO. Financing is huge. That remains a big challenge, right? And it's a real shame. People always say, well, it takes too long to build a nuclear plant. Well, the best time to start was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But really, I mean, the best time was 10 years ago because capital was dirt cheap. If government would step in there and help back a project and de-risk it, we could get it built real cheap. So those are some of the sort of ingredients of this nuclear secret sauce. And again, they're available to us here in Canada. Some of the most important ones are, some of the most irreplaceable ones are. And I want to bring it back again to what you're saying. It is the human factors. I've been reading Peter Zeihan recently, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. And he really puts an emphasis on demographic collapse in the West, in China and South Korea and Japan. And I mean, this is a key limiting factor. If we have bold ambitions to build a lot of industrial infrastructure, and again, not just out of climate imperatives, but also just out of geopolitical imperatives to reshore critical industry, that's going to depend upon, a kind of heroic blue collar effort in order to do that. And, the skilled trades aren't something that's been sexy to go into. It's been all about bits and, coding and that sort of thing, and the gig economy. And we're just running out of the kind of blue collar skilled trades that can actually build these big projects. So that is what I most worry about in terms of, the impedance to, or the sort of barriers to a nuclear renaissance. Both just, are there physically enough young people available, and B, do they want to go into the skilled trades in order to enable us to do the kinds of things we need to do as the societies that we have.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the young people it's a huge issue, and I've got some thoughts around. I think that the education system has a lot of issues. My brother tried to get a chemical engineering degree. I think there's like 100 something people. It's not a super popular degree program because it's difficult. They get in there in the first year of class and they brag about how, 85 of the 100 people aren't going to make it. We're going to weed you out, and they give you these ridiculous tests that at the beginning, they're subjective grading, and they're like, we're just going to pass 15 people and the rest of you are going to get C's or D's. And, by year 2, he's like, all right, well, my GPA is going to be so low because I'm making C's in these classes. He's like, I got to go. And he went and got into fire protection engineering. And I think he's got a good profession. But point is, he's somebody that wanted to do it, and he probably could have done it. And I think that you see that in a lot of these engineering degrees. I think you see it on the medical side too. Maybe you can talk to this. It seems very like fraternity hazing-ish to me from the outside looking in, because it's like, there's a lot of smart people out there that could probably achieve a lot. But we got to look at what these programs are set up to do. And a lot of them are set up to weed people out because that's what was done to them. And they want it to be exclusive, and they want it, so I think that's one issue I don't hear people talking about that much. In fact, you hear a lot of people that are engineers, and these people, they want it to be even worse. They're like, yeah, haze them harder, make it even harder to get that medical degree or whatever. And I'm like, shouldn't we just like be trying to get people in and like teaching them? So that's one thing I think. And then the other thing is like, you got a whole generation of people now. I think, petroleum engineering is like the lowest it's ever been in terms of new grads. You've got people that want to be in green tech, which is really like, I don't know what that is, to be honest. There's been a ton of them the last couple of years because the valuations on these green, whatever businesses have been crazy. Now they come back down to earth. So we'll see if that changes, but it's got to start with youth and perception and people wanting to do it. And you're right. Like, I don't know how we solve this problem, but nobody wants to be in like these more skilled labor or even blue collar type of professions. It's a real issue, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge. And that is something where, government policy is going to play a big role. And again, I'm just witnessing this emerging alliance, and it's very strange because, historically there were kind of left-wing labor parties, and that's, who industrial workers voted for. And then the educated elites and the so-called 1% would vote together for, the conservative party or, whatever that kind of 1%er party was. And now we're seeing this phenomenon that political scientist Thomas Piketty refers to as the Brahmin left, where the labor folks end up voting with the 1% for the kind of right-wing conservative party, and the educated elite votes for what was once the left-wing party. And so the politics are all, mired up and unrecognizable to, if someone were to time travel from the 50s and look at what is called left and what is called right in this day and age, they'd be really scratching their heads.
Right.
I do think it is interesting seeing these kind of hybrid political formations occur. And I think it's going to be interesting to see the ways in which those develop, because, this is probably a huge bit of exaggeration. But, after the Black Plague, peasants in Europe and kind of working people in Europe saw their fortunes rise a lot. Real wages went up dramatically just because there weren't enough people out there to work the fields.
Right.
You couldn't abuse a peasant like you could before the plague. And, I'm not making a COVID analogy here, but I just mean that demographically, people are aging out of those skilled trades. They're going to be an absolutely vital workforce. They're aligning themselves increasingly with, populist right-wing governments that are coming to power right now. And it's going to be interesting to see what the power dynamic is between labor and those governments, because there is tension there, between, political parties that tend to sort of side with the bosses, now trying to win over a large section of the working class as a durable portion of their electoral base. I think it's a fascinating moment. And, I do have some hope that we can sort of see something useful come out of this, and a turn back towards energy realism, and a turn back towards, centering, some of society's value and resources, frankly, towards, the working people that build our infrastructure and build our countries, frankly.
Well, I know a lot of young people listen to podcasts, and I hope that maybe in some small or maybe even in some big way, conversations like this can help spur the thoughts in young people's minds that to have a more pragmatic approach towards energy, to ask the more nuanced questions and seek those answers. And that, and I think you're doing a great job. Not to pat myself on the back too, because we both do podcasts, but point is that I think the stuff you're saying is really good. This is a fun episode. I really appreciate you carving out the time to do it. For people that don't know, where can everybody find you, and where's the best place to get access to your content?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a few places, but at Dr._Keefer is where I'm at on Twitter. Pretty active there. You can come to the Decouple podcast, where we're available for streaming on any major place where you find your podcasts. If you're Canadian, come and join us at c4ne.ca. That's the number sign 4. But yeah, those are a few ways. I'm very responsive, so feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My DMs are open, and I meet and talk to a lot of great people out there. So looking forward to chatting with anyone who wants to get in touch. And Max, thanks so much for having me on your podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Chris, it was a really fun episode. I enjoyed it. Thanks again for coming on.
All the best, man.